I took the trip because I needed to clear my head. Life had been wearing me down, long hours at work, a messy breakup, and a creeping sense that I wasn't where I was supposed to be. So, I packed up my car, left the city behind, and decided to drive with no destination in mind. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by hills and endless fields, my GPS lost signal. At first, I didn't mind. The solitude was soothing, and the winding roads offered a kind of freedom I hadn't felt in years. But after nearly an hour without passing another car, I realized I was hopelessly lost. The gas gauge was dipping toward empty, and my phone still had no service. That's when I saw it, a sign pointing toward a small town called Birchwood, 5 miles ahead. Birchwood wasn't on my map. It wasn't anywhere, really. But I didn't have a choice. The town looked like something out of an old postcard, quaint, quiet, and untouched by time. A diner with a faded sign, a general store with squeaky wooden steps, and a single gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. I pulled into the gas station, relieved to find it still operational. While I filled up, an older man approached me. He was tall and wiry, with sun-weathered skin and a cane that clicked against the pavement as he walked. "You're not from around here," he said, his voice a mix of curiosity and suspicion. I explained my situation, mentioning that I'd gotten lost and just needed directions back to the highway. The man smiled, his eyes crinkling at the edges. "You're heading the wrong way for the highway," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "You look like someone I used to know." His comment caught me off guard. I assured him I'd never been to Birchwood before, but he shook his head. "No, not you. Your father." "My father?" I hadn't mentioned anything about my family. "Your last name's Morgan, isn't it?" he asked. I nodded, more out of shock than confirmation. How could he know that? "I knew your grandfather," he said, leaning on his cane. "He lived here. Built that diner over there. My grandfather had died before I was born, and I'd never heard anything about him living in Birchwood." But the man spoke with such certainty that I couldn't dismiss him outright. "I don't think that's right," I said. "My grandfather was from Springfield." The man chuckled. "That's what they told you, huh?" He gestured for me to follow him to the diner, and despite every instinct telling me to decline, I found myself trailing after him. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and something sweet, like fresh pie. The walls were lined with old photos, black and white snapshots of the town and its people. "That's him," the man said, pointing to a group photo near the counter. I leaned in, squinting at the faded image. Sure enough, there was a man who looked strikingly like my father, a younger version of him, standing arm in arm with a woman I didn't recognize. "That's your granddad and his first wife," the man explained. "First wife?" I asked, incredulous. The man nodded solemnly. "She passed before he left town. Cancer. It broke him, losing her. That's why he packed up and moved to Springfield. He met your grandmother there, started over." I stared at the photo, trying to process what I was hearing. My father had never mentioned any of this. As if reading my thoughts, the man said, "Your dad probably didn't know. Your granddad didn't talk about it much. Too painful, I reckon." For the next hour, the man, who introduced himself as Harold, told me stories about my grandfather's life in Birchwood. How he was a carpenter who could fix just about anything. How he'd built not only the diner, but also the church down the road. And how deeply he'd loved his first wife, a schoolteacher named Rose. By the time Harold finished, I felt like I'd uncovered a hidden chapter of my family's history, a chapter that explained so much about the man my grandfather had been and the legacy he'd left behind. Before I left Birchwood, Harold handed me an old book. It was a journal, he said, that had belonged to Rose. "She'd want you to have it," he said. I didn't read the journal until I got home. Its pages were filled with delicate handwriting, recounting moments of joy and sorrow, dreams and fears. Rose wrote about her love for my grandfather, their plans for the future, and her battle with the illness that eventually took her life. Reading her words, I felt an overwhelming sense of connection, not just to her, but to my grandfather, to a part of my family's past that had been hidden for so long. That trip changed me. It reminded me of the importance of knowing where we come from, of the stories that shape us even when we don't realize it. Sometimes, getting lost is the only way to find what you didn't know you were looking for. Second story. My parents had lived in the same house for over 30 years, a modest single-story home with creaky floorboards and a backyard that had seen countless summer barbecues, birthday parties, and quiet evenings. For me, it was more than just a house, it was a repository of memories, both cherished and painful. Last summer, my mom called me out of the blue, asking for help. She and Dad were finally ready to downsize, a decision they'd been putting off for years. The idea of leaving the house behind was bittersweet for them, and I could tell from her voice that the task of decluttering was overwhelming. "I just need you to help with the attic," she said. The attic? That cramped, dusty space filled with boxes that hadn't been touched in decades. I couldn't count how many times I'd heard my parents say, "We'll get to it eventually." Now, eventually had arrived. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had, though it felt smaller somehow, less imposing than it did when I was a kid. My mom greeted me at the door with a hug, and I could see the mixture of relief and exhaustion in her eyes. "Your dad's in the backyard," she said, motioning toward the kitchen. "He's taking a break before we tackle the garage." I found Dad sitting on the old porch swing, sipping lemonade. His hair was grayer than I remembered, and he moved with a slowness that hinted at the years creeping up on him. "You ready for this?" I asked, trying to inject some humor into the moment. He chuckled. "As ready as I'll ever be. That attic's got more junk than I care to admit." We spent the morning sifting through boxes. Most were filled with the predictable stuff, old clothes, holiday decorations, and outdated electronics. But then, tucked away in the corner, I found a trunk I didn't recognize. "What's this?" I asked, dragging it into the center of the room. Dad glanced over, his expression unreadable. "That belonged to your grandfather," he said after a moment. My grandfather had passed away when I was a teenager. He was a quiet man, a former mechanic who preferred the company of his tools to people. I'd always thought I knew him, but as I opened the trunk, I realized how little I'd understood about his life. Inside were photographs, letters, and a few trinkets that seemed out of place, like the silver locket with a woman's portrait inside. "Who's this?" I asked, holding up the locket. Dad hesitated, then sighed. "Her name was Eleanor," he said. "She was your grandfather's first love." I was stunned. This was a side of my grandfather I'd never heard about. "He met her before the war," Dad continued. "They were engaged, but she passed away while he was overseas. He didn't talk about her much, but I think he kept her close in his own way." The letters in the trunk told a story of a love that was both tender and tragic. My grandfather had written to Eleanor from the front lines, describing his hopes for their future. Her replies, though cheerful, hinted at the illness that would ultimately take her life. Reading their correspondence felt like stepping into another world, one where my grandfather was more than the stoic man I remembered. He was vulnerable, passionate, and deeply human. As the day went on, I unearthed other surprises. There was an old journal belonging to my mother, filled with entries from her early days as a new parent. Her words were raw and honest, describing her fears about raising kids, her struggles to balance work and family, and her unwavering determination to give us a better life. "I didn't know you wrote," I said later, showing her the journal. She smiled softly. "It was my way of coping," she admitted. "Parenting isn't easy, and sometimes you need an outlet." It hit me then how much my parents had sacrificed for us, how they'd carried their burdens quietly to shield us from their struggles. By the time we finished sorting through the attic, the house felt different to me. It wasn't just a collection of walls and rooms, it was a vessel for stories, a place where lives had unfolded in ways I'd never fully appreciated. That weekend, we didn't just declutter a house, we unearthed pieces of ourselves, fragments of a family history that had been buried beneath the weight of time. When the house eventually sold, it was hard to say goodbye. But I left with more than just memories. I left with a deeper understanding of my parents, my grandparents, and the threads that connect us all. Sometimes, it takes looking back to truly appreciate the journey forward. Third story. It all started on a Wednesday, the kind of ordinary weekday where nothing remarkable is supposed to happen. I was working from home, juggling spreadsheets and emails, when my neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Carson, knocked on my door. Mrs. Carson was the sort of neighbor you couldn't say no to, a widowed, sweet as pie, and always ready with a plate of cookies. But her knock that day wasn't her usual visit to share baked goods. She looked worried. "Paul, I hate to ask," she began, clutching a folded piece of paper, "but would you be willing to drive my nephew, Tyler, to Greenville tomorrow? He's got an important meeting, and my car won't make the trip." Greenville was 4 hours away, and I had deadlines looming. I hesitated. "I'm not sure I can take the time off work," I said cautiously. Mrs. Carson's face fell. "I understand. It's just Tyler doesn't drive, and he's visiting me for the week. This meeting is really important to him." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Something about the way she looked at me, like I was her only hope, made it impossible to say no. The next morning, Tyler showed up at my door, duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He looked to be in his late 20s, with unkempt hair and a nervous energy that reminded me of a skittish bird. "Thanks for doing this," he mumbled as he climbed into my car. The drive started awkwardly. Tyler was polite but distant, staring out the window as I tried to make small talk. I learned he was an artist, mostly abstract paintings, and the meeting in Greenville was with a gallery owner interested in showcasing his work. About an hour into the drive, we hit a massive traffic jam. A tractor-trailer had overturned, spilling its cargo across the highway. We sat in near standstill traffic for over an hour. "I guess this is a sign," Tyler said suddenly, breaking the silence. "A sign of what?" I asked. "That maybe I shouldn't be doing this," he replied. "I mean, what's the point? It's not like anyone's going to buy my work." I didn't know Tyler well, but something about the resignation in his voice struck a chord. I found myself saying, "You'll never know unless you try. Sometimes the hardest part is just showing up." He glanced at me, surprised. "Do you really believe that?" "I do," I said, and I meant it. The traffic cleared eventually, and we continued the drive. Tyler started opening up, telling me about his struggles as an artist, the countless rejections, and the self-doubt that came with pursuing a dream. As he talked, I realized how much I related to him. I'd spent years working jobs that paid the bills but left me feeling unfulfilled. Tyler's honesty about his fears made me confront my own. We reached Greenville late in the afternoon. The gallery owner turned out to be a middle-aged woman named Claire, who greeted Tyler warmly. I decided to stick around while he presented his portfolio. Watching him share his work was like seeing a completely different person. Tyler's nervous energy transformed into passion as he explained the stories behind his paintings. Claire listened intently, nodding and asking thoughtful questions. After the meeting, Tyler looked dazed. "She wants to feature 3 of my pieces in an upcoming exhibit," he said, barely believing the words himself. "That's amazing," I said. "Yeah, but I'm terrified," he admitted. "Good," I replied. "It means it matters." On the drive back, Tyler was quieter but in a contemplative way. We stopped at a roadside diner for dinner, and over greasy burgers and milkshakes, he asked, "What about you? What's your dream?" The question caught me off guard. No one had asked me that in years. I told him about my love for writing, how I used to dream of publishing a novel but had let that dream fade in the face of practicality. "You should do it," Tyler said simply. His words stayed with me long after I dropped him off at Mrs. Carson's house that night. The next day, I sat down at my desk, not to work on spreadsheets but to outline the book idea I'd been carrying in my head for years. It felt terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Sometimes, life has a way of nudging us in the right direction, even when we don't see it coming. That drive to Greenville started as a favor for a stranger, but it became so much more, a reminder that showing up matters, that dreams are worth chasing, and that we're all capable of surprising ourselves. And as for Tyler? He invited me to his gallery opening a few months later. Standing there, surrounded by his artwork, I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride, not just for him but for myself, for taking that first step toward my own dream. Sometimes, the most unexpected journeys lead to exactly where you need to be.